Question 19. Editor. Many candidates say that if elected, they will reduce governmental intrusion into voters' lives. But voters actually elect politicians who instead promise that government will provide assistance to solve their most pressing problems. Governmental assistance, however, costs money, and money can come only from taxes, which can be considered a form of governmental intrusion. Thus, governmental intrusion into the lives of voters will rarely be substantially reduced over time in a democracy. So, first step argument or facts. Clearly we have an argument. Thus would be our structural indicator. So our final sentence, governmental intrusion into the lives of voters will rarely be substantially reduced over time in a democracy. And what is the support given for that? Well, many candidates say that if elected, they will reduce government intrusion into voters' lives, but voters actually elect politicians who instead promise that government will provide assistance to solve their most pressing problems. Governmental assistance, however, costs money, and money can only come from taxes, which is considered a form of governmental intrusion. So those are the premises in support of this conclusion, and clearly this is a flawed argument. And why is it flawed? Because the structure of the passage is as follows. The premise is that voters actually elect politicians who promise that the government will provide assistance to solve their most pressing problems. For the government to solve their most pressing problems, this is going to be taxes, which is a form of governmental intrusion. Therefore, governmental intrusion will rarely be substantially reduced over the time in a democracy. So again, you notice why? Because these politicians who they're electing promise that the government will provide assistance to solve their most pressing problems. But just because they promised it doesn't mean they're actually going to do it, as Barack Obama would be a perfect example to demonstrate. So, clearly this is a flawed argument, making the jump that because these politicians have promised to do something, therefore it is going to be done. And we know based on our experience with politicians that that clearly doesn't make any sense. So again, turning our attention now to the question stem, which one of the following, if true, would most strengthen the editor's argument? You notice would most strengthen. This is just a regular strengthen question. And again, the gap is that these politicians said they were going to do it. The conclusion is, therefore, they will do it, right? To say governmental intrusion will rarely be substantially reduced, that implies that these politicians are doing what they're saying they're going to do. So to strengthen this, we would want to tie those closer together. This idea of saying something and doing something. A. Politicians who win their elections usually keep their campaign promises. Does that strengthen? And again, it's exactly what we just talked about. The problem with this passage is that it jumps from politicians promising that the government will provide assistance to solve their most pressing problems to concluding, therefore, governmental intrusion will rarely be substantially reduced over time in a democracy. So A, the idea that politicians who win keep their campaign promises directly strengthens this argument, so A would be the correct answer. But again, let's just make sure. B, politicians never promise what they really intend to do once in office. Well, isn't that the truth? But you notice B, unfortunately, would weaken this argument by saying just because they promised it, we shouldn't be worried about it because they don't do what they promise. So B weakens the argument. Again, we're looking to strengthen. C, the most common problems people have are financial problems. Again, completely irrelevant. This is not about the most common problems that they have. This is about the type of politicians that they elect, those making promises that the government will provide assistance to solve their most pressing problems. And to solve these most pressing problems, taxes are the way to do it, which is a form of governmental intrusion. Therefore, governmental intrusion will not be reduced over time in a democracy. D, governmental intrusion into the lives of voters is no more burdensome in non-democratic countries than it is in democracies. And again, you notice completely irrelevant. This argument is about democratic countries and what we're going to see over time with them because of the nature of the politicians that people elect, combined with the fact that to solve pressing problems, which is what these politicians are promising to do, is going to result in an increase in taxes, which is a form of governmental intrusion. Therefore, governmental intrusion will not be reduced over time in a democracy, or substantially reduced. And then lastly, checking E, politicians who promise to do what they actually believe ought to be done are rarely elected. And the problem with E is it doesn't help us because the passage told us that voters actually elect politicians who instead promise that the government will provide assistance to solve their most pressing problems. Again, we don't know whether or not they actually believe this ought to be done. So we cannot apply E, does not help us, completely irrelevant because it does not apply to the passage. All we know is that voters are electing politicians who are promising that the government will provide assistance to solve their most pressing problems, not about whether they actually believe that the government should provide assistance to solve their most pressing problems. So E is irrelevant and E would be eliminated.